tell you that the people who sent their regrets to this meeting, who would have been here, but they're going to view the recording, is Gina Whitney, Marion Jalazny, Meta Cahill, Ellen Mack, and Kate, our leader, Schumacher, who has the flu. And then 3 little dates for you. March 8th, a month from now, our monthly meeting will be at the library, and it's a live program of panel discussion.
It's March 5th.
With women leaders in local government. We have a great panel of 4 or 5 led by our mayor, Patricia Farmer, Hendricks Farmer. And it's going to be an excellent panel. It's in person only at the library beginning at 7 p.m. on Wednesday, March 8th. What do I mean?
March 5th.
Yeah, sorry, on Wednesday, March 5th. Excuse me, on Wednesday, March 5th. And then we have selected the date of our annual meeting, which will be Wednesday, June the 18th. And just as we did last year, we are going to meet at Cobblestone Country Club Sunroom. And you'll be hearing much more about that and how we're negotiating for the most reasonable price we can get. But June 18th, you could save that date as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our member, Steve Lestition, who among his various, well, he's a retired dean of Princeton University, but he was incredibly generous with his time. He's a member of our league with his wife, Beth Morgan, and he served on the education committee of the Reparations 2-year study. And when it came to the housing committee, he also wrote the housing committee report. Now, this study guide, as you know, I'm trying to get this in your view. As you know, it's a lengthy 46-page PDF, but it is accessible to all of you. And then the last big announcement, especially I had to reassure those who could not attend tonight's meeting, is that the vote on the 4 questions, which are in the guide and which we emailed you this morning, the 4 reparations questions for which our league has to reach consensus, those are going to be emailed out to you separately using some wonderful question and answer app so that we can gather all of your votes and tabulate them and then tell you how our league, voted on these questions. So I think without further going on by me, I'll introduce Steve Lestition. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Nicole. I'll try and speak clearly because I don't know quite what your audio is like. I think that the organizers of the reparations study did a good job giving you an introduction to the kinds of definitions they've seen out there about reparations, the kinds of pros and cons there, and a whole lot of other resources down the bottom. But what I thought was really helpful to start with, and I encourage them to think about this, is just the larger question that we're often confronted with, who are anyone interested in this topic, of why should we in the present care about something that's accumulated so long over the past? And the most powerful explanation or way of thinking about it that I've encountered is in Isabel Wilkerson's CAST study. Chapter 2 is called An Old House and an Infrared Light. And she starts by reminding us of what it's like to move into an old house. She says the inspector trained his infrared lens onto a misshapen bow in the ceiling, an invisible beam of light searching the layers of the lathes to test what the eye could not see. This house had been built generations ago, and I had noticed a slight welt in the corner plaster in a spare bedroom and had chalked it up as, you know, just some chance. But over time, the wealth became a wave, it widened, it bulged, etc. So she goes on to build on this metaphor. America is an old house. We can never declare the work over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheaval batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Anyway, she goes on for a bit, but then really gets to the point.
Excuse me, Steve. Stay there with Isabel Wilkerson, please. But Beth Morgan, could you please set it up so Steve's face is the only one on the screen, please?
You can do that. You just go to speaker. Everybody just turn your thing to speaker.
Oh, everybody.
View. Yeah, you can just turn your view to speaker. Where it says view.
Oh, view. Okay, yeah. View in the very topmost right corner, speaker. Thank you.
Does it work?
It worked for me. Now you've got the whole stage to yourself, Steve, and you're still with Isabel Wilkerson.
All right, so let me finish. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable, loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades. Beth is sighing next to me. Many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous peoples, never owned slaves. And then she returns to her own voice. Yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but we are here, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joints, but they are ours to deal with now, and any further deterioration is in fact on our hands. Anyway, I think that's a very useful perspective on the kind of situation we find ourselves in this country that's been here for a long time and developed over time. So while our working groups for the reparations study were 5 different ones, what I wanted to do today was just remind you that all those 5 factors, all those 5 elements constantly interacted over time, influenced each other, built a cumulative set of issues, stresses, inequalities that we've inherited. And it's important to remember how long they've been building and how complicated those interactions are. So just looking at any one of the studies doesn't quite give you the big picture. You sort of have to try to weave them together. So that's what I'm going to do. Beth's going to put up some slides that I created just to remind you how one can try to view them that way. Okay, so there's about 4 big time frames that are relevant to this question of reparations. One is the colonial era, the pre-Civil War era, when there were in fact enslaved people here in New Jersey and elsewhere in the United States. There's the post-Civil War era, after the Civil War, where there was a brief Reconstruction era that then was blocked and to some extent failed. This is not moving forward. Hang on. This worked earlier in the day. Okay. This one. Oh, I see. All righty. And then there was a 3rd phase beginning around the first part of the 20th century that brought a lot more African Americans, blacks from the South into New Jersey, increasing the population multiple fold. But it was also the beginning of what we would now recognize as segregation, of residential segregation. And then the final phase, which is really important for us to think about, is the civil rights era after World War II, where attempts were made to correct some of the inequalities, correct some of the harms that were being done, but those really never fully were carried out. So we have to understand how some of the long-term inequalities endured through this last phase. Now, can I go back?
You want to go back?
Yeah. Okay, there we go. So I think it's pretty straightforward to say that in the pre-Civil War era, the colonial era of slaveholding, there were sort of natural inequalities. There were economic inequalities. The labor of the slaves was being expropriated. They did not keep the fruits of their own labor. They did not live in economic conditions, income conditions that were appropriate to what they were actually furnishing by their work. There was obviously social inequalities. There were segregated living arrangements. They were barred from, in a sense, learning to read and write. That was seen as dangerous. The exceptions that were made were usually for some religious instruction sometimes. And this even became true for those blacks who began to be emancipated in New Jersey through the early part of the 19th century, after 1804. There were free blacks in New Jersey, but there was very little education available to them. There was no public education in those years. Equally importantly, there were harsh penal practices throughout this pre-Civil War era, what might be called by historians low status punishments. You can do this to the people on the very bottom of the social ladder. Whippings, mutilations, branding, these are the kinds of punishments that were inflicted on slaves. And that had a heritage that carried over into the rest of the 19th century and perhaps even down into the 20th century, unfortunately. And then finally, just to see where New Jersey stood within the big spectrum of states, by the 1830s, it was, of all the slaves still existing in northern states, New Jersey had 2/3 of it. So New Jersey was the slave state of the North in a certain way. Okay, post-Civil War. You would say there was still continued economic discrimination that affected them. They were not encouraged to take apprenticeships to learn vocational trades. There was a system in agriculture in New Jersey called cottaging, which was a kind of sharecropping, which was a kind of exploitive relationship between the property owner and the workers on the land, and that affected them. And then, of course, there's the famous blocking of Union generals' promise of 40 acres and a mule for anyone that wanted to move out to, the Northwest Territories and become a farmer. Well, that failed. That was never carried through. So there was economic discrimination and hardships.
What time do you have? I have 7:19.
Okay, someone is talking to me. Okay. Segregated schooling existed and segregated accommodations throughout the 19th century, despite New Jersey the legislature passing some laws in 1871, 1880, saying blacks had access to all white schools. But in practice, these laws, historians say, were never enforced. And there was a kind of general social prejudice to keep schools segregated, all black schools, all white schools. And black schools were typically underfunded. Finally, there's this tradition of carrying on low status punishment for prisoners, specifically forced labor. Going to a rock pile and cracking the building blocks for a prison. That happened in New York State. But the most spectacular or outstanding dimension of that is embodied in the U.S. Constitution's 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, except for those convicted of a crime. So it was still legal by constitutional law up to today in the Constitution to require involuntary servitude for those convicted of a crime. This is the U.S. version of carrying over low status punishments into the present. Okay, we're going to move to the next era. This really shows how what we're familiar with in contemporary America really began. Great waves of migration of Black residents out of the South, north into cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, New York City, Newark. The trouble is that they became victims of sort of segregation in practice, residential segregation in practice, carried out by real estate brokers just looking at the sort of social values of the population and saying we will put them into the less fixed up poorest housing and charge them whatever we want. They're desperate for housing, so we can just exploit them that way. Then there is the practice in law of what's called restrictive covenants. And this carries on through until the 1940s. It wasn't outlawed until, I believe, by Supreme Court decision in 1948. Property owners could put into their legal deeds, this cannot be sold to a Black person. So there was restrictive covenants that were beginning to be used as early as the beginning of the 20th century to exclude Blacks from certain neighborhoods. Added to this was the process of industrialization of the northern cities, so that what was once a more mixed population of Blacks and whites, because Blacks were servants or worked in restaurants or worked in certain kind of craft industries, when industrialization came along, these factories were more specifically located, and neighborhoods grew up around transportation routes and factory developments, which allowed for the the then existing process of segregating by races to occur. The U.S. government then got involved in a sense, authorizing this. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, under the New Deal, started a mortgage subsidization program that redlined neighborhoods. And you can see the redlining of neighborhoods in Trenton, you can see the redlining of neighborhoods in Newark, anywhere in New Jersey that had an urban population, saying, do not give mortgages. These mortgages to these neighbors is too risky. Therefore, banks and real estate agents would not give subsidized federal mortgages to residents of the poor Black neighborhoods or the poor immigrant neighborhoods. So this redlining existed, again, for a long time until the 1960s. And even to this day, a few years ago, a bank up in the north was settled a case where they continued, in a sense, de facto redlining in neighborhoods up in northern New Jersey. This basically started blocking Blacks from moving into other neighborhoods because the mortgage bankers and real estate agents knew that they would gain more wealth if they could keep the two housing markets segregated. In the same period, the percentage of segregated schools in New Jersey increases. It doesn't decrease in the first half of the 19th century. And the harsh police practices continue. And then you saw the resurgence of Ku Klux Klan activity along the Jersey Shore. There were some famous marches there, and even in Trenton, New Jersey. The final stage is the era 1950s to the present that we're still the heirs of. There was a civil rights movement. There were some very important civil rights laws, fair housing law in the 1960s. But the catch was that the federal government after World War II started giving out subsidized mortgages to GI veterans and educational benefits, but Blacks were either excluded for the mortgages or they did not have the educational background from their neighborhoods and their training to take advantage of the educational opportunities to go to college, or even more unfortunate, there were so few black colleges that they were hugely oversubscribed. There were, something like 20,000 applicants for 100 spots in some of these all black, historically black universities. So the accumulated educational disadvantages continued. The growth of the suburbs and the flight of white residents from urban areas to these suburbs, fueled by the GI Bill, created the segregated residential patterns we see in New Jersey to this day. The Fair Housing Law of the 1960s was supposed to block discrimination, but in fact, the modern studies show that it was not enforced. And to the extent that the federal government was still cooperating with private bankers, private business, insurance companies, real estate agents, they were in fact exploiting the whole system to make as much profit as they could off of the two segregated housing areas of white suburbs and black urban areas, that they could flip over the housing there rather rapidly in and out. The couple of other factors play into this segregation process, residential segregation process. Nixon and Reagan's move toward law and order agenda, and then the war on drugs beginning in the 1980s, resulted in policing of black areas, mandatory minimums, and then a process that can be only called mass incarceration. The side effects of black individuals, the side effects were, in a sense, a loss of citizenship for those people. They lost the right to vote until now. If you're incarcerated, and access to jobs or housing when they come out of prison. The schooling structures in New Jersey, because of the very, very long-standing tradition of home rule, is also deeply segregated along the lines I just described, making New Jersey the 6th most segregated schools in the nation. So that's the statistics. So here are, I should have gone through all of those slides, but here's a good resource for looking at the final status of where New Jersey stands now. The New Jersey Institute of Social Justice has a report available online called Two New Jerseys, One State of Inequity. So they have these kinds of statistics. White home ownership rate in New Jersey as of very recently, and black home ownership. White median net worth of families versus black median net worth of families. Median income of New Jersey white households, black median income. And then the number of percentage of white residents in the poverty level, and the number of black residents in poverty. White residents lacking health insurance coverage, black residents lacking health insurance coverage, white residents reporting as of 2008 having asthma versus black residents. And then I'm just putting a footnote there. The report says you can see very similar disparities for conditions like hypertension, diabetes, etc. And then finally, ratio of black youths in prison to white youths, 29:1. Ratio of blacks imprisoned, black adults, to whites is also very high. And this is quite striking stuff. Want to return?
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
let's see. So, Steve, is this a pausing point or a stopping point?
It's a stopping point. I am done. The only thing I might mention is that back in July of 2022, we a group in the community showed up at the town council to encourage them as a town council to encourage the New Jersey legislature to pass the New Jersey Reparations Task Force Act, and they did so in July of 2022.
We asked the state to form that task force, but they never did, right? The Institute.
No, the bill has not been heard
right,
or
but
passed.
the Institute for Social Justice did create its own reparations task force.
Committee, a council of some sort, yes.
So what I'd like to do for our audience is two things. I'd like to ask you to use either the chat or the hand raised when you have a question for Steve. And I'm going to quickly read the 4 questions that we're all going to be asked to vote on. And then I strongly suspect that people in our audience will want to pose questions to Steve as they try to figure out how they are going to vote on these questions. And I'll run through the questions first, all 4 of them. Question A, does the legacy of slavery still impact Black and African Americans today? Question B1, should the League of Women Voters of New Jersey support the provision of the broad range of possible reparations to Black and African Americans? These reparations focus areas include, but are not limited to, policy reforms in the following areas: housing, criminal justice, education, healthcare, and economics. And you'll see that's the same breakdown area that is represented in the report. The second part of question B, which is question B2, should the League of Women Voters of New Jersey support reparations in the form of cash payments to Black and African Americans? And the final question, which is called question C, oh yeah, we've got A, B1, B2. Question C, should the League of Women Voters of New Jersey take a position in support of reparations? So we want to, I've seen one comment in the chat. Does anybody, oh yes, the raise hand button is under react. But if people aren't clamoring with questions, I'm going to ask Steve to address the what I consider the most thorny question of the 4 questions, which has to do with cash payments. Should the League of Women Voters of New Jersey support reparations in the form of cash payments to Black and African Americans? Steve, I'm sure your committees must have talked about cash payments, and I think I've also heard that, or maybe I read in the report, that we're not just talking about, we're talking about Blacks as a group of people all experiencing the legacy of slavery, whether or not they themselves were descended from slaves. Is that correct?
You've asked 2 questions.
Yes. Okay. We'll start with that one about who, and then we'll talk, and then if you could talk about money.
A caveat, just a cautionary statement. This is not something our working groups ever talked about. It was not, we're not tasked with talking about that. Okay. So, you know, all I can do is express a personal opinion, or basically maybe reflect what I've seen being discussed out there, in the general, debate being made about reparations in California or New York. Those are two of the states. Or Evanston, Illinois is actually a pioneer on actually creating reparations for residents of Evanston who had family connections back there to a certain period of time. So that's one example where a town has decided that, yes, you very specifically have to have been a resident in this town up to a certain point to get the kind of reparations they're talking about. What California is actually doing, I believe, I did read the executive summary of the California report, which is out there. Anyone can read it. I believe you have to trace descendants from his African Americans that were here during the period of slavery, I believe. Now, I know there's some towns in California that are doing something like what Evanston is doing that may or may not be connected to the California Reparations Study, which is to say some towns expropriated Black land along some very lovely beachfronts that when the family's been suing them for a long, long time to try and, eminent domain or something to, I forget for what purpose the housing and land was taken, but now are going to be compensated for what in retrospect appears to have been both a discriminatory and exploitive appropriation. So there's different approaches to it. So the more thorny question is whether or not, financial money should be given to them. There is a case to be made, and historians are making it, that whole industries in the United States, the wealth of northern clothing manufacturers, of northern banks, were heavily built on trading southern cotton before the Civil War, after the Civil War, all kinds. So there's this idea that huge portions of what you just say is white wealth across the United States was built on the cotton industry or other industries like that, maybe tobacco as well. And so who should compensate for the exploitive labor? There's I think an economist who worked in Senator Warren's staff came up with a metric whereby you could simply start taxing businesses for this and using that money to pay descendants of those. So that would be linked to the descendants of that particular region in that particular time. So those are some of the ways that this issue has been thought about.
Because when you look at the arc of time that has passed since enslaved people were, even since enslaved people, were brought to this country, it just seems to me that there's no amount of actual physical money that could conceivably could be gathered together and redistributed to the descendants of slaves, because it would be, probably $1 billion per family or something. It seems to me it would be very huge.
Well, that's an opinion.
Is there another question from the audience? Yes, Marcia Steinberg, please unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
Okay, just to follow up on that, it seems to me whatever amount might be determined and who might get it, the giving of money would be helpful to the recipients in the immediate time that they get it. But that doesn't change the structural situations that create the inequalities. So I personally am not in favor of the cash payments, but I think that does not address the underlying issues. And if you don't correct the underlying issues, then you're just perpetuating the system, is the way I look at it.
I think that's a fair. I think that's a fair assessment, because it's the financial payments are not necessarily going to correct the over policing of Black neighborhoods and mass incarceration. That's and the continuing mandatory minimums and prosecution of excessive prosecution of drug dealing. So there's. And then the other thing that was which was really challenging to many of us on the working groups, the California executive summary does talk about the principle of reparations. And one of the possible principles, and I believe it's in the California report, is whatever problem you're trying to solve, reparation is guaranteeing that this will not recur. You're actually repairing it rather than simply compensating for it momentarily. You've got to actually get to the root of it, which is what Marcia is saying. How do you get to the root of some of these harms and say these will, the repair that's appropriate is that this will not recur again?
I would like to step in here with one answer to, we've got two comments in the chat, one from Kiana Childs Alexander saying that she plans to vote yes to each question, and thank you. And for anyone who joined us late, the ballot for your questions will be distributed after this meeting tomorrow or Friday. You'll get it by email, your ballot. But we also have a kind of a musing from Nikki Carpinelli about the extent to which the League of Women Voters mission would align with this particular study of the question of reparations to be given in New Jersey. So I'm just going to address that and answer Nikki's question, because the mission of the League of Women Voters, Nikki, is very heavily focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so because that has become one of our major focuses, it was only logical when you're talking about structural racism and structural economic segregation, structural housing segregation, the structure to help families create wealth, because of these are all issues that are connected to reparations. That is why this 2-year study was proposed in 2023, sorry. It was proposed in 2023 at the New Jersey League's Biennial Convention. And at that convention, all the delegates did vote to conduct, this very ambitious study, and especially a study that is razor focused on New Jersey's, particular world, which is very shocking, to outsiders. The very first time I came and drove across New Jersey, I told a friend from outside this area, I said, it's such a weird place. You just, like, every time you get to a city, all the residents are Black. And then when you get to the suburbs, all the residents are white. And New Jersey is this place with these, large Black cities, Trenton, Newark, Camden. I had never seen anything like it in the United States, including like, really awful places in the South. I mean, our segregation.
Yeah.
And the fact
that was one reason we picked Lawrence, because we liked that Lawrence was kind of a mix and the schools are kind of a mix. That was one reason we chose to be here.
Yes, and I think, I would, same here, but it was quite a few years that I had been living in the state of New Jersey that I actually joined the New Jersey Regional Coalition and found out the same And this was 20 years ago, and the same statistic is still being quoted. New Jersey's schools are the sixth most segregated schools in the United States. So obviously, those of us who do make New Jersey our home, would like to see some progress. Sandy Smith now also has a comment in the chat. Do you want to just speak your comment, Sandy, or do you want me to read it?
Well, I was thinking that instead of cash payments, something like, lower rate mortgages, some kind of support for buying a home, because that's a big discrepancy in New Jersey. Or again, educational support would be better than just cash payments.
In the sense that you feel it would go further and be more long lasting?
Yeah, just more effective than just giving someone cash.
Okay, and the floor is still open for questions, but since we have a few minutes, I'm going to ask Steve if he would share with us the sense of his committees about what it might take to make some forms of reparations a law in New Jersey.
Well, the bill itself, and I believe the study kit materials that were sent by Eileen and Wendy to you all, has the text of the bill. It doesn't specify that. That is just a study of the issue of reparations with some suggestions that then the legislature and then the governor would have to decide that these are the appropriate reparations. The committee, the bill itself does not choose any specific. It says set up a task force to study what they ought to be.
Do you personally think that calling for a task force, a state mandated study task force, is the best route for New Jersey to move this question of reparations forward?
Well, that's a political question in a sense, because you've got, I was trained as an historian. I'm an historian by background. That's the way I think. I think the New Jersey citizens do not know this history, therefore probably wouldn't simply understand it. The task of a task force is to educate the citizenry of why this is an important issue for them, and therefore they should think about what would be repairs of the house that they're living in. So it's an educational problem, and I don't think this history is well known. It took us a lot of time to dig through the material on it. It's not out there. It's not. And when I spoke before the town council back in 2022 about the task force bill, I said I looked at a study by the American Historical Association, study of American people just before the pandemic, like 2018, that said most people get their knowledge of American history from movies and television. Stop and think about that. And textbooks from high school are like way down the list. 5% of the people put it down. And this is the reality. And I hate to say, what I've just described as the findings that we came up with is not what you see in movies and in television. So there's a task there. The task force has a task.
I would absolutely encourage all of our members who are on the call this evening, when you download this reparation study guide, the number of links, of live links to online histories and statistics is just amazing. And as Steve is saying here, it will open a lot of eyes to documented data that many of us are unaware of. So the study guide is far more than just the 48 pages that you see, because there's hyperlinks throughout it to data gathering from different organizations and from the New Jersey state government, etc.
Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Could we do this same kind of presentation down at the village?
Oh, at Eggers Crossing Village.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
it's
Beth
a great
says,
idea.
Beth says we say yes.
That's a pretty big yes,
Yeah,
and Fred, and also I will have to double check with the state league, but with any luck we can duplicate a whole stack of the study guide that,
Mhm.
you know, if it was live and in person, we could distribute the study guide at the same time.
Yeah, I'd like to, the Civic League is having a meeting this Saturday. And I would like for them to help sponsor something like this, because I think it all goes into what we're trying to do, is to get communities together and get communities organized. And you know, as Steve just said, nobody knows much about reparations, even though they've heard it talked a lot. So I think this would be a good start in getting people involved.
That's a terrific idea, and I have a feeling that Lawrence Neighbors Together might want to get on that bandwagon too. We could have quite a community forum.
Yeah, right.
In that way, if all groups were invited. That's a great idea, Fred. And I'll just double check about the guide, but I'm sure we want to have it read widely, because I mean, I'll just quickly mention 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 people worked for 2 years on this study. So it is a significant amount of effort we're seeing here.
Good.
More comments or questions from anybody?
Oh, I don't know if I'm unmuted. I think I'm unmuted.
You are, Jim Cleek. You are unmuted.
The questions, the questions all are, I mean, the 4 questions are kind of general, and it's real natural. I think that most of the poorest people would rather get a cash payment, and that's only natural. But I think I kind of agree with what the other lady said, that it's not going to change the problem much. And as far as saying about those people who would say, I didn't have anything to do with this, and my ancestors didn't have anything to do with it, I don't think I ever did anything bad, but I recognize that by being born white, I had advantages that other people didn't have. And that's we didn't see, we talked about the issues, the differences of people who were descendants of slaves, than those who didn't come here until the Jim Crow area, but still suffered terribly, but not quite to the same degree. Those descendants of those and descendants of those that came, and I don't know how you distinguish them, and or are we saying that we can't distinguish them? We have to just treat everything the same. And the other thing, it's a terrible thing to think about, but what about the slippery slope of other groups who have, like the American Indians and the Chinese Exclusionary Act and other groups that have suffered terrible discrimination? Nothing's been the same. Nothing's comparable to slavery, but there are other things. And is this going to be other groups that are going to be, they did pay individuals from the Japanese internment camp, but that were the people, living people at the time, and they gave a flat payment. But that, I don't know, I hate to muddy the water, but I'm just throwing out thoughts.
No, you're not muddying the water at all, Jim. I think those are interesting points you make, and I think people who see the study, who download the study, will see that under the section of pros and cons of reparation, there is a set of 2, 4, 6, 8 arguments against the League of Women Voters adopting a reparations position. And I believe one of them does touch on the question of other disadvantaged ethnic groups. So it's fine for you to have raised that. It's 5 till 8, and who else? Oh, yes. Go ahead, Marcia. Now this might be.
I'll make it quick. I find that the consensus questions are too vague, too broad. B1 says, should the league support the provision of the broad range of possible reparations? But there's no statement as to what the possible reparations are. And so I don't know what I'm saying yes to. It's like signing a blank check. I find the wording of this.
No, in defense of the study and those questions, Marcia, I think you need to go back to the introduction and the pros and cons pages, because let's face it, the League of Women Voters personally can't do a darn thing on its own. But of course, together we build power, we educate the public. And so what this study group is trying to do is educate the public and also set a few markers. I mean, no, it wouldn't be appropriate for the League of Women Voters to say, this is the reparation we want, and this is when we want it, and this is where we want it. Nobody's inviting us to do that. So these are, as you pointed out, much more broad guidelines of where the membership stands on, the various issues about reparations themselves and changing the structural landscape to try to right some past wrongs. And I think Sandy Smith bringing up the simple question of greatly subsidized mortgages to promote home ownership by families of color. These are all small steps that can be taken. Any last comments from our listeners or from you, Steve?
No, I think, our working groups really didn't talk about that preface of what reparations were. We never were asked. So, that's a more complicated question that the task force should take up, basically.
Terrific. Okay, well, thank you so much, Steve Lestition, and his helpmeet, Beth Morgan, and all of you, League members, and our guest Belinda Silva, for joining us tonight and beginning this sharing this study of reparations for New Jersey.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, thank you very much. Good night.